It's one of the weirdest facts hiding inside you right now. Inside of all of us, actually. A recent study published very recently, March 18th of 2025 to be precise, has discovered something very wild about our DNA. About approximately 20% of it comes from a population way more archaic than we first thought. Every single cell in your body, whether it's part of your skin, your bones, your brain, or your blood, carries a full copy of your DNA. Nothing new here. There's roughly 6 feet of DNA crammed into a nucleus only a few microns wide, coiled and compacted with almost incomprehensible precision. The amount of sheer information stocked inside of you is even more insane than what you think. If you stretched out all the DNA in your body end to end, it would reach the moon and back over 250,000 times. Your genome is made up of about 3.2 billion base pairs, A's, T's, C's, and G's, that together form the instruction manual for building and running a human being. If all of it was digital, it would take about 1.5 gigabytes of storage, which is about the same size as the entire install file for the original Half-Life. Everything it takes to build you could fit on the hard drive of a 1990s gaming PC, right next to crowbars and headcrabs. And for the past few decades, scientists have been obsessively trying to decipher just that. They were so obsessed that back in 1990, a project was launched to fully sequence the human DNA, the Human Genome Project. One technological progress after the other, it successfully reached that goal in 2003, over 13 years later. It involved more than 20 institutions across 6 countries and cost about $3 billion. Today, thanks to new technological leaps, the same thing can be performed in less than 24 hours, for about $200. We've learned a lot and became pretty efficient. We now know that about 1.5% of your genome actually codes for proteins, the structural and functional molecules that make life happen. Another 8% comes from ancient viral infections, genetic hitchhikers from the deep past. About 10% of regulatory DNA manages when, where, and how much your genes are expressed. And the biggest chunk, somewhere around 60%, is made up of repetitive sequences, stuttering copies of the same fragments over and over, like a scratched record. Now, back to the topic at hand. If we know so much, what's so wild about these 20%? Well, the thing is, contrary to what we've been thinking most of our history, we do not come from one human ancestry. A fifth of our DNA is coming from a human population we diverged from 1.5 million years ago. That's roughly 600 million base pairs, equivalent to the entire genome of a mouse, or 4 times the genome of a fruit fly, just sitting there. This might not sound like much stated like this, but take back 20% of us, and we're rendered completely useless. And when you think about it, it's very disturbing. We mixed with Neanderthals and Denisovans a lot more recently, and still, we got 1 to 5% of their DNA, depending on your ancestry. And despite such a huge percentage, we know absolutely nothing about these guys. No remains, no fossil record, nothing corresponds to what we found. It's as if evolution wrote the story of life, and then buried a secret chapter in every one of us. And to this day, the question remains, where are those 20% coming from? How did it got there in the first place? This is what we're going to look into in today's video. A puzzle in the code. It's nothing new anymore that we, modern humans, have inherited parts of other hominins' DNA. Non-African populations and descendants inherited between 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA. Neanderthal emerged approximately 500,000 years ago and lived alongside Homo Sapiens in Europe, Middle East, and Western Asia. Sometimes alternating the occupation of the lands, sometimes coexisting there. Sites like Kafse and Skul in modern-day Israel show that both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals occupied the region at different times, possibly trading places over thousands of years. In Europe, Neanderthals were already occupying the space when sapiens arrived around 45,000 to 50,000 years ago. The overlapping of the presence of both species lasted at least 5,000 years, possibly way longer, especially in the Middle East and Asia. Denisovans, the second archaic hominin we have DNA traces in us, is less widely spread. Actually, it's only present in Melanesian populations, Philippine Negrito groups, or some East Asian populations, ranging from 0.1% up to 6% at most, especially for Melanesians. Since we found parts of their DNA within us, we know that interbreeding occurred with Homo sapiens. We even have proof that Neanderthals and Denisovans interbred with each other, as backed by the remains of Denny, a teenage girl that lived 90,000 years ago, who is an hybrid of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father, who himself had Neanderthal ancestry from previous generations. Even with the recency bias in genetics, that more recent interbreeding are less diluted in subsequent offsprings. Despite all this happening at least 200,000 years earlier than our encounter with both archaic hominins, we still have only 1 to 6% of their DNA at most. Now that all of this has been laid as the groundwork, we mentioned a specific study at the beginning of this video, published in Nature on March 18th, 2025. This study bases its conclusions on data from the 1,000 Genomes Project, which describes itself as a catalog of common human genetic variation, using openly consented samples from people who declared themselves to be healthy. What's actually pretty cool about this project is that anyone can browse through the data they collected for free. I strongly encourage you to go and check it out. If you're curious enough, I'll put the link in the description of this video for those interested. But back to our topic. Based on these data, here's the story found in our DNA. 1.5 million years ago, 2 human populations diverged from each other. One composes 80% of modern human current DNA. This is probably the population that gave birth to Neanderthals and Denisovans as well. The other is the one that's composing the remaining 20% of our DNA, and it's coming from this ghost population. 1.5 million years ago is the point of divergence between us. At that point in time, Homo ergaster was roaming around in Africa since approximately 1.9 million years ago, so a good 400,000 years prior to the split. Homo ergaster is mainly considered by the scientific community to be the earliest form of Homo erectus. It had more modern body proportions, long legs, short arms, a slimmer build than later Homo erectus, and thinner skull bones, with brow ridges less pronounced. And there was another contender for the throne of hominins, Homo erectus, born slightly later, 1.8 million years ago. He is considered by many researchers as the evolved form of Homo ergaster that emerged in Asia. Many scientists consider early Homo erectus and ergaster so similar that they basically belong to the same species. Others think geography and skull differences are enough to categorize them as separate species. Earliest traces of erectus leaving Africa date back to 1.85 to 1.78 million years ago, with Homo erectus georgicus, a subspecies of Homo erectus. We also found traces of erectus presence in Indonesia, more precisely Mojokerto, in between 1.6 to 1.8 million years ago. Now, if erectus had started to split into smaller population pools by 1.75 to 1.8 million years, this means that the said populations had been isolated from the main ones for a significant amount of time. Enough time for it to have adopted specific traits, more adapted to its close environment, or just that it was isolated enough for it not to get any new incoming genes from the main population. Fast forward to 1.5 million years ago. In Africa, ergaster was still mainly present, while erectus was more spread in Eurasia. Then, 2 populations split from each other, for reasons we still ignore to this day, unfortunately. What we know is that the split happened on the basis of 2 African populations, most likely in Homo ergaster populations. And during 1.2 million years, both populations coexisted in the same world. Still, even if we know who they might have evolved from, that ghost population of very archaic hominins have DNA that doesn't match with anything else. Most surprising is this proportion of DNA. In 2020, a study analyzing genomes from Yoruba and Mende individuals in West Africa revealed that between 2 and 20% of their DNA came from an unknown archaic human population. The same population we've been mentioning that hadn't been identified in the fossil record. 20% is far from being inconsequential. It's a huge chunk of an individual. If you take 20% DNA out of anyone, the result is not going to look pretty. Such a large amount of DNA suggests that the mixing of population wasn't a one-time occurrence, but a more prolonged and regular interbreeding, happening probably over tens of thousands of years, to the point one population just completely absorbed the other without a trace left of them. Similar findings started showing up across the map. Different teams, using different models and data sets, kept seeing the same pattern. Ancient introgression, genetic mixing from deeply divergent humans, wasn't a one-off. It was everywhere. In East Africa, the same strange signals appeared. Genetic fingerprints that didn't match any known Homo Sapiens groups. Too old. Too different. In Central Africa, among populations like the Baka and Biaka, researchers found more of the same. Ancient stretches of DNA that couldn't be explained by Neanderthals or Denisovans. None of these groups had ever left Africa. They hadn't crossed paths with Neanderthals in Europe, or Denisovans in the icy caves of Siberia. And yet, the signs were there. Whole sequences of DNA, hundreds of thousands of years old, woven into the genome like fading ink in a family scroll. And the same truth always showed up, no matter the methods and models used. One of the first tools was the D-statistic, also known as the Abababa test. It looks for patterns in how DNA is shared across 4 genomes, flagging segments that seem to come from a third, missing ancestor. Another one was the hidden Markov models, algorithms that track how DNA recombines over generations. These models spot stretches of DNA that are unusually divergent, mutated in ways that don't match anything in the known human family tree. And finally, in 2023, scientists applied a new model, Cobraa, a cutting-edge approach that looks at how nearby DNA fragments coalesce over time. They found something even more stunning. This ancient integration wasn't isolated to Africa. It was global. Every modern human alive today carries DNA from a population that split off from our ancestors 1.5 million years ago, stayed apart for over 1 million years, and then merged back in about 300,000 years ago. This was no brief encounter. It was a major event, a full-scale fusion of 2 ancient human lineages, and today, that forgotten population still accounts for roughly 20% of our genetic ancestry, leaving plenty of questions behind. What drove us apart? Expanded with science. The first one of these being, so what could have caused that ancient fork in our family tree? We're talking about a split that happened right in the heart of the lower Pleistocene. This wasn't a peaceful period. Earth's climate was entering a period of massive fluctuations, known as the mid-Pleistocene transition. Glacial cycles intensified. Sea levels rose and crashed. Rain patterns shifted dramatically across Africa. In short, the environment went haywire. This alone could have fractured early human populations. A once-connected band of Homo ergaster could have been cut off by drought, desertification, or retreating food sources. Isolation doesn't need to be dramatic. It can be as simple as one valley drying up, or one river redirecting, cutting off gene flow between groups for millennia. This could be plausible, as the population of hominins back then was relatively small, perhaps on the order of tens of thousands globally, maybe 10,000 to 30,000 reproductively active individuals, at most. But there's also a deeper evolutionary concept at play: population structure. Even within a single species, if small groups stay reproductively isolated for long enough, due to geography, climate, or even behavior, they start to drift. Genetically, physically, culturally, this is called deep population substructure, and it's exactly what the nature study modeled, using Cobraa. And living in small groups they were. Think bands of 100 to 1,000 individuals moving within limited regions, instead of assuming all early Homo were one panmictic, meaning a population in which every individual has an equal chance to mate with any other individual. Cobraa simulates split and merge dynamics. Groups diverge, evolve in partial isolation, then occasionally mix. It's not 2 separate species. It's one species with a complex, braided history. Think of it less like a family tree and more like a delta, streams splitting and rejoining, shaping each other, but also carrying their own sediment. So what's the hypothesis? The majority lineage, the one making up 80% of our DNA, may have originated in more interconnected and mobile bands of Homo ergaster across East and South Africa. They spread wide, faced harsh challenges, and underwent a bottleneck. Possibly linked to migration out of Africa, disease, climate collapse, or a volcanic catastrophe like the Toba eruption approximately 74,000 years ago, which nearly wiped out early Homo sapiens, for example. The minority lineage, meanwhile, may have persisted in ecological refugia, stable zones that didn't collapse during climate extremes. They may have been smaller, more localized, but also more genetically diverse. They didn't suffer the same population crashes, and so, when the 2 groups reunited around 300,000 years ago, the 20% of DNA we inherited from them looked much older, because it was. Their lineage had been quietly diverging for over 1 million years, accumulating differences that now stand out in our genomes like ancient code, written in a forgotten dialect. That's why modern humans share more genetic similarity with Neanderthals and Denisovans, who emerged after the split, than with this deeper ghost lineage. And that's also why we haven't found them in the fossil record. They may have looked almost identical to us. They may not have had any distinctive anatomical features. Or their bones may be waiting in caves and sediments we haven't touched yet. We weren't looking for them, because until recently, we didn't know they were ever missing. Why did one take over? Though, that's the part that still haunts the story. If both lineages were human, if they mixed, if one gave us 80% of our genome and the other 20%, then why didn't they survive as equals? Why don't we have a 50% split for each? Why did one end up taking over? The answer, as always in human evolution, isn't simple. But it's not about being smarter, or better, or more evolved. It's about numbers, movement, and chance. See, the lineage that gave us 80% of our DNA didn't just get lucky genetically. They spread, grew, and multiplied. At some point after the split, maybe 800,000 years ago, maybe even later, they went through a bottleneck. Something cut their numbers down to almost nothing. Only a few thousand of them remained. What's clear is that this bottleneck was brutal to say the least, while the one composing 20% of our DNA apparently maintained its genetic diversity. Were they occupying the same areas? Did one start a massive migration wave out of Africa, only to come back later? Was one population fleeing from a massive threat that caused the bottleneck on the other? The only thing we can state is that the bottleneck endured by the main population is probably the reason they were tougher and better equipped for survival in the 1.2 million years that followed. We know that bottlenecks tend to strip away diversity, but they also concentrate traits, the ones most suited for survival. The survivors are often the strongest, the smartest, the most adaptable, or just the luckiest ones to be standing when the dust clears. And that's most probably the group that would go on to become Homo Sapiens. And when they eventually reconnected with the ghost population, sometime around 300,000 years ago, it wasn't a clash, as it seems all genetic diversity has been preserved. It was a merger. One group was just bigger. Maybe they were more mobile, possibly more social, and definitely they grew a lot faster. So generation by generation, they didn't erase the ghost population. They just outnumbered them, leading to a full absorption. Their descendants had more children. Their genes spread farther. Their version of humanity just scaled better. Biologists call this demographic swamping. No wars, no bloodshed, not even a full-on takeover. Just plain, slow math of mating and migration. And on top of that, natural selection added its own edits. When researchers looked at where the ghost DNA survives in our genomes today, they found something strange. It's not random, and it's not evenly spread. It's mostly far from protein-coding genes, the blueprints for the stuff our bodies actually build. That suggests selection against it. Maybe because it didn't work well with the rest of the system, but in some very specific places, it stuck. It's actually enriched in genes related to brain development, neural communication, cognition, learning, which means parts of how we think, how we process the world, how we connect. May not just come from Homo sapiens. They may come from someone else, someone that perceived the world in a more archaic way than our other ancestors. Why haven't we found their bones? This leaves us with another question that turns the situation from surprising to unsettling. We can see their DNA. We know they were real. We carry 600 million base pairs of their genome, enough to build a small mammal. So where are they? Why can't we find a single skull, a jawbone, a molar? Why don't we have a name to give them? This isn't just an archaeological gap. It's a void at the center of our origins. And we found ancestors way older than them, way more archaic. So why don't we find anything? There might be a few reasons why it might exist. First, fossils are rare. Hominin remains, especially those older than 300,000 years, only fossilize under very specific conditions. Dry caves, fast burial, low oxygen. Most of the continent doesn't preserve remains like that, especially not tropical Central Africa, where decomposition happens fast and the soil is acidic enough to dissolve bone. That's the exact same reason that archaeologists struggle to find any fossils in Asian and South American soil. They're both very humid, tend to speed up decomposition, and are even acidic enough to dissolve stuff on their own, on a very long time scale, though. Second, we've barely looked. Most of Africa is underexplored compared to Europe and Asia. Fieldwork has historically focused on Eastern and Southern Africa, where famous finds like Lucy, Turkana Boy, and the Tong Child were uncovered. But Central and West Africa remain underrepresented, both in digs and in funding. Different reasons for that, but among them, we can most definitely state the economical challenges and underdevelopment of the regions in questions, as well as their political instability. That really doesn't help to work in safe conditions for researchers. If this ghost population lived in dense forests, or wet, erosive terrain, their bones may simply be just gone before we even started to look for them. Maybe even before we started to write or get the wheel, or maybe still waiting beneath untouched layers of sediment that only await for us to come. But it's harsh to know precisely where to look, as we have absolutely no hints on a precise geographical area. Third, they might not look different enough. If they were Homo ergaster derived, or another branch of early Homo, their skeletons might be indistinguishable from other early humans. We may have already found them, and mislabeled them because they were just so close we labeled them as the same. Or worse, we found them and threw them out, because they didn't fit the story we thought we knew, because up until now, we weren't looking for a population that had no name. We were looking for the ones we already expected: Sapiens, Erectus, Habilis. This ghost lineage could be hiding in plain sight, in a drawer or on the shelves of a museum, tagged with the wrong date, the wrong species, the wrong assumptions. What else don't we know? If there's one thing this story teaches us, it's how little we truly understand about ourselves. For the longest time, humans' origins were widely depicted in religions, and most people believed these narratives. Then science's reign came forward, and for decades we told a simple story about human origins. One lineage, one direction, from primitive to modern, from chaos to civilization. But the truth is stranger than that. We're not a logical path of evolution, one species after the other. We're the survivors of collisions, ancient meetings, forgotten mergings, lost worlds blending together. And if 20% of our DNA comes from a human lineage we know almost nothing about, then what else do we still ignore? How many other populations lived, thrived, and disappeared? How many times has humanity nearly disappeared, only to rebuild itself from a handful of survivors carrying fragments of a larger story? We can map the genes, model the splits, and simulate the ancient landscapes, but we can't yet fully answer the simplest questions. Who were they? Where did they live? What differentiated them from us? What reunited us? As we progress in discovering our origins, it's becoming clear that we're only the product of survival, chance, and connection. And we're still learning what it means to be human, both in our genes and in our history. If this story sparked something in you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the deep past. Like the video if it helped you see humanity in a different light. Share it with someone who's ever wondered where we really come from. And if you have thoughts, questions, theories, even just what part of this story stayed with you, drop them in the comments. I read and respond to them. This is the best way to help this channel grow and spread the echoes. There are more chapters hidden in our distant history, more names we don't know about, and many more to discover. Thanks for being part of this adventure with me. Until next time, keep listening to the echoes.